a massive explosion rips through your position without warning. You're thrown violently into the dirt, ears ringing so loud you can't hear your own screams, blinded by thick black smoke that burns your lungs. You scramble desperately to your feet, coughing up ash, only to realize the absolute nightmare scenario has just happened. The supply wagons carrying your army's entire stock of gunpowder have accidentally detonated in a chain reaction of fire and destruction. You're a Spanish soldier in April 1503, standing in a shallow ditch outside the town of Cerignola, and you have just lost all your ammunition. Every ball, every charge, every ounce of powder gone in one catastrophic moment. Panic erupts instantly like a wildfire through dry grass. Men are screaming that God has abandoned them, that this is divine punishment, that they're cursed to die. Some are already throwing down their weapons and running. Then the ground beneath your feet begins to vibrate with a rhythm that makes your stomach drop. Through the clearing smoke, you see them approaching. 12,000 French soldiers in perfect formation, led by the finest, most feared heavy cavalry in all of Europe. They're charging directly at your position, and they're close enough now that you can see individual faces behind the visors. You're outnumbered more than 2 to 1. You're outgunned by the best military force on the continent. And now, you're potentially defenseless, without ammunition. The rational thing to do is run. Everyone knows it. The line is starting to break. But in the absolute middle of this chaos, while men are deserting and the world is ending, your commander does something that defies all logic. Gonzalo Fernandez de Córdoba doesn't flinch. He doesn't panic. He doesn't even look worried. He rides his horse straight into the center of the panic, stands up in his stirrups so every terrified man can see him, points directly at the burning wreckage, belching black smoke into the sky, and shouts at the top of his lungs, "Good news! Friends, these are the victory lights God has sent us. We won't need artillery tonight, because we're going to win with steel and courage alone." He's lying. Of course, he's absolutely terrified inside. But his lie, delivered with perfect confidence, stops the rout dead in its tracks. It forces 5,000 desperate men to turn back around and face the oncoming wall of steel and death. This isn't just a battlefield accident or a stroke of bad luck. This is the opening move of the Battle of Cerignola. April 28th, 1503. The exact moment where the Middle Ages collide violently with the modern era and only one survives. This is the day everything changes forever. This is the day the night dies and the future is born in blood and gunpowder. But before we dive deeper into this story that will redefine what you think you know about warfare, courage, and the death of chivalry, make sure you hit that subscribe button for Maproom Battles. What you're about to witness is the most one-sided massacre in military history. And it happened because one man understood that the future belongs to those who dig ditches, not those who charge at them. Now wipe the dirt off your face and look carefully at what's coming to kill you. To understand why you should be absolutely terrified right now, you need to understand exactly what the enemy is. The French army approaching through the smoke isn't just a military force. It's an undefeated monster that has crushed every opponent for 100 years. The French gendarme, the fully armored heavy cavalryman, has been the apex predator of European warfare for longer than anyone can remember. They are the tanks of the 16th century, except more terrifying because they're alive and they hate you. They don't use clever tactics or cunning strategies. They use physics. They point themselves at your position, and they smash into infantry lines at full gallop. And the infantry lines simply break like glass under a hammer. It's a simple, brutal law of nature that has never been violated. And what do you have to stop them? You have a ditch that you dug this afternoon with shovels. You have a dirt rampart made from the excavated soil. And you have a weapon that most knights consider an insult to warfare itself, the arquebus. A primitive firearm that's barely more sophisticated than a metal tube attached to a stick. It's painfully slow to reload. It's wildly inaccurate, beyond 50 yards. If you miss your one shot, you're dead long before you can reload. The knights charging at you have been training since childhood to kill men like you. You've been training for maybe 2 weeks. But Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba has a plan that defies every piece of military wisdom accumulated over 1,000 years of European warfare. He isn't meeting the French on the open field where they're invincible. He's deliberately dug himself into a defensive position. He's turned this vineyard into what he hopes will be a kill box, specifically designed to slaughter cavalry. The explosion you just survived was a genuine accident, a stroke of terrible luck. But everything else you see around you, every foot of trench, every pile of dirt, every sharpened stake hidden in the shadows, is cold, calculated military engineering. The trench in front of your position is deep enough to stop a charging warhorse dead in its tracks. The dirt wall is high enough to shield you from crossbow bolts and give you a stable platform to rest your heavy weapon. The French see you waiting behind your pathetic dirt mound. They see a small, terrified army huddled behind a pile of earth. They laugh at you. They're so absolutely confident in their overwhelming superiority that their commander, the Duke of Nemours, hasn't even bothered to wait for his full army to assemble. He's attacking immediately with just his advance guard. He wants to crush you before the sun goes down so he can sleep in a comfortable bed tonight. As the French trumpets sound the charge, the vibration in the ground turns into a thunder that shakes your bones. Thousands of armored horses break into a full gallop. This is the moment of truth. In the old world of medieval warfare, these knights would ride over you, scatter your formation like leaves in the wind, and hunt you down for sport. But today, standing in this ditch with your matchcord burning and your arquebus leveled over the dirt wall, you're about to introduce them to the new world. The panic from the explosion has been replaced by something else, a cold, hard focus born of desperation. The knights are coming fast, and they have absolutely no idea that they're charging at full speed into their own graves. Can a ditch and some peasants with guns really stop the most powerful army in Christendom? You're about to find out. To truly understand the sheer insanity of standing in that ditch, waiting for death to arrive, you have to understand what was thundering down that hill toward you. You have to comprehend that the French army of the early 1500s wasn't just another military force you could defeat with better tactics. It was a cultural institution, a force of nature, an expression of divine right made flesh and steel. They were the undisputed heavyweight champions of Christendom for generations. And the terrifying core of that power was the gendarme. The word gendarme eventually comes to mean police officer in modern French, which is almost funny when you know the original meaning. Back then, it meant man-at-arms, and these men were not police. They were gods of war. These were the elite of the elite, aristocrats by birth and killers by profession and training. To put a single gendarme on the battlefield required the economic output of a small village for an entire year. Think about that. One man cost as much as feeding 100 families. He wore a complete suit of Milanese plate armor that weighed about 60 pounds but was custom fitted to his body like a second skin. It wasn't just metal. It was engineering perfection, designed by master craftsmen to deflect sword strokes and shatter lance tips. The joints articulated perfectly. The helmet provided vision while protecting the face. It was the pinnacle of medieval technology. He rode a destrier warhorse, a beast bred specifically for violence, over countless generations. These horses were massive, aggressive, and cost more than the armor itself. Training one took years. Losing one in battle was an economic catastrophe. In the context of the Italian wars that had been raging for years, the French gendarmerie was considered completely invincible by everyone who mattered. They had smashed the legendary Swiss pikemen, who were supposed to be unbeatable. They had run over the Italian city-states like they were made of paper. They had humiliated every army that dared to meet them in open battle. Their tactic was brutally simple: the shock charge. They didn't bother with clever maneuvers or flanking movements. They lined up knee to knee in a solid wall of steel and horseflesh, and they hit the enemy's center like a sledgehammer hitting a pane of glass. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't elegant. But it didn't need to be either of those things because it worked every single time. Leading this terrifying machine was Louis d'Armagnac, the Duke of Nemours. He was the Viceroy of Naples, a man of the highest noble blood and even higher confidence in his own superiority. Nemours was the perfect embodiment of everything the medieval knight was supposed to be: brave to the point of recklessness, dashing in appearance, supremely skilled in combat, and catastrophically arrogant about his place in the world. He looked at war as a sporting event between gentlemen, not as the brutal struggle for survival it actually was. To him, the Spanish army under Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba wasn't a worthy opponent deserving respect. They were a nuisance, an annoyance, peasants playing at war. For months, the French had been chasing the Spanish across southern Italy like hunters pursuing wounded prey. The Spanish had consistently refused to fight, always retreating, always skirmishing and running away, always avoiding a pitched battle where the French could use their overwhelming cavalry advantage. In the eyes of Duke Nemours, this behavior was pure cowardice. He didn't understand that the Spanish were buying time deliberately. He didn't see the strategy behind the constant retreats. He only saw weakness and fear, which made him feel even more superior. So when his scouts reported that the Spanish had finally stopped retreating and were actually digging in near the town of Cerignola, Nemours didn't see a trap being prepared. He saw prey that had finally cornered itself. He saw an opportunity for glory. He saw an easy victory before dinner. His lieutenants advised caution and careful planning. The French troops were genuinely exhausted from marching all day in the brutal heat without adequate water. The supply lines with food and additional ammunition hadn't caught up yet. Some of his veteran captains, men with decades of experience, suggested waiting until the next morning to attack. Let the men rest overnight. Bring up the artillery. Do proper reconnaissance of the Spanish position. It was completely sensible. Sound military advice from professionals who knew their business. But Nemours refused to listen. He was personally insulted by the very idea of waiting even a few hours. He reportedly said that to delay the attack would be interpreted as a sign of fear. and he would rather die than appear afraid of Spanish peasants. He was driven by the toxic pressure of the chivalric honor code, the need to be the first to charge, the first to strike, the first to claim glory. Waiting was for cowards and merchants. Real knights attacked immediately. Could you have stood up to that kind of peer pressure when everyone around you expects instant aggression, and anything less is seen as weakness? That's the world Nemours lived in. And it was about to kill him. He looked at the Spanish position through the eyes of medieval prejudice. He saw a low hill covered with vineyards. He saw some dirt piles. He saw frightened men hiding behind inadequate defenses, and he dismissed it all as beneath his concern. He didn't respect the shovel as a weapon of war. That was for peasants and laborers. He believed completely that spirit, that indefinable quality the French called élan, could overcome any physical obstacle. Courage and noble blood would triumph over dirt and cowardice. This was the fundamental, fatal flaw embedded deep in the French nobility's worldview. They were fighting a war of prestige and honor and tradition, while their enemy across the field was fighting a war of pure survival, using any method that worked. Nemours gave the order to attack immediately. He didn't wait for his infantry support to arrive. He arranged his cavalry in 3 massive blocks of armored death and prepared to do what French knights had always done for centuries: ride straight at the enemy and crush them through superior force. As the French lines began to move forward, the ground literally shook under the combined weight of thousands of armored horses. It was a magnificent, terrifying sight, a glittering wave of steel and silk banners advancing with mechanical precision. From the outside, to anyone watching from a distance, it looked like the inevitable triumph of tradition and power. But they were riding directly into a new reality they couldn't imagine. They were charging toward a man who had spent his entire military career analyzing exactly how to kill them efficiently. The French were bringing courage and cash to the battlefield. Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba was bringing geometry and gunpowder. The juggernaut was moving forward with unstoppable momentum. But the architect was calmly waiting behind his wall of dirt. And he knew something they didn't. Momentum means nothing if you can't reach your target. The trap was ready. The bait had been taken. Now came the killing. But who was this Spanish commander, willing to bet everything on a ditch? What made him so different from every other general of his era, while the Duke of Nemours was playing the traditional part of the medieval hero riding to glory? His opponent was inventing an entirely new role, the modern general. Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba, known to history as El Gran Capitan, the Great Captain, was everything Nemours was not. He was 50 years old, a seasoned veteran who had already spent a lifetime in the saddle fighting wars across Europe and North Africa. But unlike the French aristocracy, who viewed war as an extension of jousting tournaments and personal honor, Gonzalo viewed war as a problem to be solved through intelligence and innovation. And he was a man who hated losing infinitely more than he loved honor or glory. To understand why he was digging ditches in Cerignola instead of charging heroically like a proper knight, you have to go back 8 years to a place called Seminara. In 1495, Gonzalo had met the French gendarmes in open battle for the first time. He had done everything right according to traditional Spanish military doctrine. He deployed his light cavalry, called jinetes. He positioned his sword and buckler infantry properly. He followed all the established rules of warfare. The result was an absolute, humiliating catastrophe. The heavy French knights smashed through his light cavalry like they were made of paper and straw. Gonzalo was completely defeated and forced to flee the battlefield, saving his own life only because a loyal subordinate gave him his horse. Most commanders of his era would have blamed bad luck or the cowardice of their troops after such a defeat. They would have tried the exact same tactics again, hoping for different results. But Gonzalo was different. He was a pragmatist who analyzed his defeat with the cold precision of a scientist studying a failed experiment. He realized a fundamental truth that would literally change the course of history, the medieval Spanish way of war: fast. Mobile skirmishing with light cavalry was completely obsolete against the overwhelming shock of French heavy cavalry. You could not dance around a tank. You had to find a way to stop it cold. So he did something radical that scandalized the conservative military establishment. He reinvented his entire army from the ground up. He studied the Swiss mercenaries and learned how they used massive blocks of long pikes to keep cavalry at bay. He studied the emerging technology of gunpowder weapons that everyone else mocked as unreliable toys. And then he did something no one else had thought of. He combined them into a single system. He created an army where the pikemen protected the gunmen from cavalry charges, and the gunmen killed the enemy from a distance before they could close to sword range. It was the birth of combined arms tactics that would dominate warfare for centuries. But Gonzalo's genius wasn't just tactical. He was also a psychological master. He understood something most generals of his time completely missed: a soldier who is paid regularly, fed adequately, and respected as a human being fights infinitely harder than a starving conscript who's treated like disposable cattle. He was famous for eating the same food as his common soldiers. He slept on the ground with them during campaigns. He listened to their complaints and actually tried to solve their problems. In an age where most generals saw soldiers as expendable resources, Gonzalo built a cult of personality through genuine care. When he told his men that the exploding wagons were victory lights, they believed him because they wanted to believe him. They trusted him with their lives because he had earned that trust through years of keeping his promises. Could you inspire that kind of loyalty? Would you follow a leader into what looked like certain death just because he asked you to? But Gonzalo's greatest weapon was something even more powerful than loyalty or tactical innovation. It was his complete lack of ego about how he won. The Duke of Nemours felt compelled to attack immediately, to prove his bravery and maintain his honor. Gonzalo had no such insecurity. He was perfectly happy to look like a coward if it meant winning the battle and keeping his men alive. When he arrived at Cerignola earlier that day, he didn't look for a flat field where he could charge his cavalry heroically. He looked for an advantage. Any advantage. He saw the sloping ground of the vineyard. He saw the soft earth that could be excavated. And he saw the ditch, probably just an irrigation channel or a boundary marker for the vines. It wasn't much. It was maybe 3 feet deep and 4 feet wide. But Gonzalo looked at it and saw a fortress. He immediately ordered every single man in his army, from the officers to the drummer boys, to start digging. He widened the ditch. He deepened it. He piled the excavated dirt into a rampart called a talus. Then he did something incredibly vicious that shows how his mind worked. He ordered his men to sharpen wooden stakes and plant them at the bottom of the trench and along the face of the wall, points facing outward. This was not chivalrous warfare between gentlemen. This was industrial efficiency designed to kill as many enemies as possible. He was turning the battlefield into a machine specifically designed to strip the French of their greatest advantage: momentum. If a French horse hit that ditch at full gallop, it would crash and stall. And a stalled knight is just a heavy man in a metal can, waiting to be opened like a sardine tin. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, Gonzalo rode along his defensive lines on his small warhorse. He'd given up riding the heavy destriers years ago. They were too slow and inflexible for his style of warfare. He carefully positioned his new creation, the arquebusiers, right at the front line, behind the protective dirt wall. Behind them, he placed the German mercenary pikemen he'd hired, the Landsknechts, to act as a solid anchor. On the wings, he placed his heavy cavalry, but not to charge gloriously. Their job was purely defensive, protect the flanks, and prevent the French from circling around. He had built a perfect defensive engine, but he knew that a defensive engine is completely useless if the enemy doesn't attack it. He needed the French to be stupid. He needed them to be arrogant. He needed them to charge directly into his trap without thinking. Fortunately for Gonzalo, he understood the French aristocratic mind as well as he understood his own. He was counting on their pride to overrule their judgment. He was betting 5,000 lives that the Duke of Nemours would not be able to resist the bait. And as the French trumpets blared in the distance, signaling the advance, Gonzalo stopped his horse at the top of the hill and watched calmly. The trap was set. The architect had finished his design. Now he just needed the juggernaut to step inside and spring it. The machine was ready to test whether the future could defeat the past. But could a ditch really stop the most powerful cavalry in Europe? If you asked a military historian to name the most important weapon at the Battle of Cerignola, they might say the arquebus. But if you asked the men who were actually standing there that day, covered in dirt and sweat, they would point to something much simpler and more humble, the shovel. For the last 4 hours, the Spanish infantry hadn't been sharpening their swords or practicing their marksmanship. They had been moving earth under the baking Italian sun. They had transformed a shallow agricultural irrigation ditch into a death trap using nothing but manual labor and sweat. This wasn't the sophisticated stone engineering of a medieval castle. It was crude, ugly, and completely improvised. But in warfare, ugly works better than beautiful. Function matters more than form. The trench itself wasn't particularly impressive by modern standards. It was perhaps only 5 or 6 feet across and maybe 5 feet deep. To someone visiting the site today, it might look like a construction trench for a sewer pipe. But to a horse, especially a horse carrying 300 pounds of armored knight and galloping shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 other horses in a dense formation, it was a mathematical impossibility. A destrier warhorse is an incredible athlete capable of jumping significant obstacles when properly prepared, but not when it's carrying massive weight, and certainly not when it's in the middle of a packed charge with no room to maneuver. The trench forced the cavalry to stop, and that was the entire point of Gonzalo's design. He understood that the French charge relied entirely on kinetic energy. If they were moving at 30 miles per hour, they were unstoppable by any medieval weapon. But if they were standing still, they were just expensive targets waiting to be killed. The ditch was the brake pedal that stopped the French war machine. Behind the ditch, the excavated dirt was piled up to create a rampart, what military engineers call a talus. This low wall served 2 crucial purposes. First, it physically blocked the horses from scrambling up the other side, even if they somehow crossed the ditch. Second, and perhaps more importantly, It provided a stable rest for the heavy arquebuses. Imagine being one of those Spanish gunmen. You're exhausted from digging. Your hands are filthy with mud. You lean your heavy weapon against the soft earth of the rampart. This dirt wall stabilizes your aim dramatically. It protects your body from enemy crossbow bolts. It shields you from the psychological terror of seeing a wall of horses rushing directly at you. You're no longer standing naked in an open field. You're in a fortress, however temporary and crude. Behind you, the German Landsknechts are forming up in their distinctive formation. These are terrifying men in their own right, professional mercenaries who dress in flamboyant slashed clothing and wield 18-foot ash pikes. They are the anvil to your hammer. If any French knight somehow manages to clear the ditch, the Landsknechts are there to pin him to the ground with their pikes. The genius of this defensive setup is its invisibility from a distance. From the French position at the bottom of the hill, the ditch is completely hidden by the tall vineyard vines and the wild grass. The French commanders can see the Spanish battle standards. They can see the men standing on the rampart, but they absolutely cannot see the hole in the ground until they're right on top of it. It's the same principle as a ha-ha wall, a sunken fence usually used in fancy landscaping to keep farm animals out of a garden without spoiling the view. Except here, the animals are armored killers worth fortunes, and the garden is a carefully designed slaughterhouse. The sun is now dangerously low on the horizon, turning golden and blinding anyone looking up the hill from below. In the Spanish lines, the order is quietly passed down from man to man. Check your match cords. The soldiers blow gently on the slow-burning ropes soaked in saltpeter to keep the embers glowing hot. The smell of burning hemp mixes with the dust and sweat. You look over the protective dirt wall. The French vanguard is organizing for the final charge. You can hear the mechanical sounds of thousands of stirrups being adjusted, the metallic snorting of horses, the clanking of armor. It sounds like a factory coming to life, a machine of death preparing to operate. They're less than a mile away now. The distance is closing fast. The trap is dug. The stakes are sharpened. And the only thing left to do is wait for the avalanche to hit the wall. Can dirt and wood really stop steel and courage? You're about to find out. And the answer will change warfare forever. You are crouched behind the dirt wall, hands shaking slightly, holding the instrument of your potential salvation. To the knights charging toward you down that hill, this object you're clutching is an abomination against nature and God. They call it the devil's stick or the thunder tube. You call it an arquebus, and it might be the only thing standing between you and death. In 1503, this weapon represents cutting-edge military technology. But let's be completely honest, it's an absolute nightmare to operate under combat conditions. It's a heavy smooth-bore iron tube mounted on a clumsy wooden stock. The whole thing weighs somewhere between 10 and 15 pounds. It doesn't have a trigger in the modern sense that you can just pull. Instead, it has a serpentine lever holding a smoldering piece of hemp rope that's been soaked in saltpeter. To fire this contraption, you have to press the lever down, which lowers the burning rope into a small pan filled with priming powder. If it's raining, the whole system won't fire. If it's too windy, the priming powder blows away before it can ignite. If you pour too much main powder charge, the gun can explode catastrophically in your face and blind you. If you pour too little, the bullet just bounces harmlessly off the enemy's armor like a pebble, and the reload time is absolutely excruciating. It takes nearly 2 full minutes for even a skilled, experienced soldier to reload this weapon. In those 2 minutes, a cavalryman on a fast horse can ride half a mile and run you through with a lance before you can defend yourself. So why is Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba betting his entire army's survival on this primitive, unreliable piece of junk? Because he understands the cold, hard economics of Renaissance warfare better than anyone alive. To create a single French gendarme, you need a nobleman born into the right family. You need to feed him the best food available for 20 years while he grows. You need to train him extensively in horsemanship, swordsmanship, and all the complex etiquette of knighthood. You need to buy him a specially bred warhorse that costs the equivalent of a modern Ferrari. You need to outfit him in custom-fitted armor that costs the equivalent of a house in a nice neighborhood. When that man dies in battle, he's absolutely irreplaceable. You've lost a lifetime of investment and training. Now look at the arquebusier standing next to you. He's a peasant who was probably starving in a gutter in Castile just 2 months ago. You handed him a cheap iron tube that cost maybe a week's wages to manufacture. You taught him the basic loading drill in 2 weeks of training. If he dies in the next 5 minutes, you just grab the gun from his cold hands and give it to the next desperate peasant who needs work. The arquebus represents something revolutionary, the industrialization of killing. It takes the skill out of warfare. You don't need to be physically strong to pierce armor anymore. You don't need years of training. A chemical reaction does all the work for you. A scrawny, underfed teenager who can barely lift a sword can pull a lever and punch a hole through the armor of a duke who traces his noble lineage back to Charlemagne himself. That's why the knights hate this weapon with such passion. It's not just dangerous to them. It's deeply insulting to everything they believe. It democratizes death in a way that feels like cheating. But here's the thing. One arquebus by itself is essentially useless. It's wildly inaccurate beyond 50 yards. You literally couldn't hit a barn door if you aimed carefully at it. But Gonzalo's genius was realizing that while one gun is a joke, 1,000 guns firing simultaneously create a wall of lead that doesn't need accuracy. He didn't train his men to aim. He trained them to fire together in coordinated volleys. He treated the entire unit as a single massive organism, a shotgun the size of a football field. As the French get closer with each passing second, you blow gently on your match cord again. The red ember glows brighter. The sulfur smoke stings your eyes and makes them water. You're not a warrior in the classical romantic sense. You're a technician of industrial violence. And as the ground shakes harder with the approach of the enemy, you realize with crystal clarity that the era of the sword is ending today. The era of the bullet is about to begin with a deafening roar. Are you ready to pull that lever and change history back on the French side of the hill? Duke Nemours watches the thick black smoke still rising from the Spanish lines where their ammunition wagons exploded. He interprets this disaster exactly as Gonzalo feared he might not, as a warning sign, but as an invitation to easy victory. To Nemours' medieval mind, that explosion confirms every bias he holds. The Spanish are incompetent, disorganized, and terrified. He genuinely believes they are blowing up their own supplies in a panic because they're preparing to flee like cowards. The sun is dipping dangerously low on the horizon. If he waits any longer, he loses the daylight. If he loses the daylight, the Spanish might slip away in the darkness like they've done for weeks, refusing to fight. The pressure of the chivalric code is screaming in his ear like a demon. A true knight does not wait for better conditions. A true knight does not ask for a fair fight. A true knight attacks with courage, regardless of circumstances. Nemours ignores the obvious exhaustion of his horses. He ignores the fact that his infantry support is still miles behind, dragging their feet in the dust. He turns to his heavy cavalry, the pride of France, the men who have never lost, and gives the order to advance immediately. The formation of the French charge is a thing of genuinely terrifying beauty if you're watching from a safe distance. It's a solid wall of steel, with men and horses packed so tightly together that witnesses say you could throw a glove in the air and it would land on armor without touching the ground. As they begin to move forward at a trot, the ground trembles like an earthquake. The trot accelerates into a canter. The canter builds into a full gallop. The sound is like continuous thunder rolling across the landscape. But there's a fatal problem with their approach. That Nemours can't see the battlefield of Cerignola is not a flat bowling alley. It's crisscrossed with agricultural paths, irrigation ditches, and rows of tall vineyard vines. The vines obscure the ground level completely. From the saddle of a moving horse, especially amidst the dust and the blinding glare of the setting sun, the Spanish position looks weak and vulnerable. The French can see the dirt mound, but they absolutely cannot see the depth of the ditch in front of it. They assume it's a minor obstacle, perhaps a shallow depression that a well-trained destrier can clear with a single leap. This is the fog of war in its most literal sense, visual obscurity creating deadly ignorance. Nemours is charging at full speed into an information void, making assumptions based on medieval precedent rather than actual reconnaissance. He's leading the charge himself, positioned on the right wing, gleaming in his expensive silver armor that catches the sunlight. He wants the personal glory of the first kill. He wants songs sung about his courage. He's riding dangerously far ahead of his own support troops, confident that the sheer weight and terror of his arrival will cause the Spanish peasants to drop their guns and run like rabbits. The distance closes with terrifying rapidity. 500 yards, 400 yards, 300. The thunder of thousands of hooves drowns out all other sound completely. The French lower their massive lances, wooden beams over 10 feet long, tipped with razor-sharp iron, specifically designed to punch through plate armor and shatter bone. They're locked onto the Spanish flags fluttering behind the dirt wall. Their vision is narrowed to that single target. It's only when they're less than 50 yards away, mere seconds from impact, that the reality of the situation reveals itself like a curtain being pulled back. The leading knights suddenly realize with dawning horror that the minor obstacle is actually a 5-foot-deep trench lined with sharpened wooden stakes designed to impale horses. They desperately try to pull up their reins. They try to turn their mounts. But you cannot stop a freight train instantly. The laws of physics don't care about your panic. The horses behind them are still charging forward blindly, unable to see the danger, pushing the front rank inexorably toward the hazard. Duke Nemours' supreme confidence evaporates in a split second, replaced by the sickening realization that he's led his men directly into a trap. The hubris of aristocratic certainty has delivered them straight into a wood chipper. The arrogance of assuming peasants couldn't possibly outsmart nobles is about to be punished. And now, Gonzalo's architectural design is about to be tested in blood. The juggernaut hits the brakes hard, But it's far too late. They're already in the kill zone. And you're about to find out if your arquebus can really kill a god. Are you ready to fire? The momentum of the French charge dies, not with a single dramatic crash, but with a chaotic stumbling confusion that's almost worse. The front rank of horses, sensing the dangerous drop of the trench through animal instinct, instinctively slam on their brakes. They rear up violently, twisting their bodies, sliding in the loose dirt at the edge. The knights behind them, completely blind and deaf inside their enclosed helmets. I have no idea what's happening up front. They crash into the rear of their comrades at full speed. In one terrible instant, the most powerful mobile military force in Europe is transformed into a traffic jam of tangled horses and cursing men. And this is exactly the moment Gonzalo Fernandez de Cordoba has been waiting for. The French are now less than 15 yards away. They're stationary, confused, and packed so tightly together that you literally couldn't miss them if you tried. From behind the protective dirt wall, a whistle blows sharp and clear. Or perhaps a sword drops as a signal. The order is given in a voice that cuts through the chaos. Fuego. 1,000 arquebuses fire at the exact same fraction of a second. The sound is not a series of individual pops. It's a single earth-shattering roar that physically punches the air and makes your chest vibrate. A massive cloud of white sulfur smoke instantly engulfs the entire Spanish line, blinding everyone on both sides. But the arquebusiers don't need to see their targets anymore. They know exactly where the enemy is. On the other side of that smoke, the effect is absolutely apocalyptic. At this point-blank range, barely 10 yards, the notorious inaccuracy of the arquebus is completely irrelevant. The soft lead bullets traveling at supersonic speeds do not respect the social status of the men they hit. They do not care about noble lineage or years of training. They smash into the Milanese plate armor of the French nobility with unstoppable force. For 100 years, this armor has made these men virtually invincible. Arrows bounced harmlessly off it. Swords glanced away without penetrating. It was the ultimate defensive technology of the medieval world. But a heavy lead ball fired from 10 yards away carries a kinetic energy that physics cannot ignore. It punches straight through the carefully crafted breastplate, shattering ribs and lungs. It tears through the visors of helmets, destroying faces. It rips through the unarmored necks and legs of the horses. The front line of the French army doesn't just fall, it evaporates like morning mist in the sun. It's a scythe cutting through wheat. Men who spent fortunes equivalent to modern mansions on their equipment are dead before they even hit the ground, killed by peasants they couldn't even see through the smoke. Could you pull that trigger knowing you're killing someone's son? Someone's father war doesn't care about your feelings. And then comes the second horror that the French didn't anticipate. The Spanish don't just fire once and stop to reload. Gonzalo has drilled them extensively in a rotating fire system that maximizes their killing power. As the first rank fires their weapons and immediately ducks down behind the wall to begin the agonizingly slow reload process, the second rank steps forward into position. Boom! Another devastating volley tears into the confused mass of French cavalry. Then the third rank steps up. Boom! A third volley. It's relentless rolling thunder. A continuous stream of lead that keeps the air constantly filled with death. The French knights, trapped at the front, are experiencing a nightmare beyond anything in their experience or training. They cannot cross the ditch that's blocking their path. They cannot retreat because the men behind them are still pushing forward, completely unaware of the slaughter happening at the front of the column. They're stuck in the kill zone, screaming orders that no one can hear over the deafening roar of the guns. The horses, maddened by the terrifying noise and the searing pain of bullet wounds, begin to stampede in pure panic. They rear up and crash down, trampling their own masters who've fallen. It's complete chaos. In the vineyard of Cerignola, the sun has now fully set, but the constant flashing of the muzzle blasts provides a strobe light effect. It illuminates brief, horrific snapshots of the massacre, a duke falling from his saddle with blood pouring from his armor, a horse rearing up with a shattered leg, a battle standard falling into the dust. The thunder echoing off the hills is the sound of the Middle Ages breaking apart. The invincibility of the armored knight is gone, blown away in a cloud of black powder smoke that will never clear. In the middle of this smoke-choked hell, Louis d'Armagnac, the Duke of Nemours, is desperately trying to rally his men. He's screaming at them to find a way to bridge the ditch, to push forward, to maintain formation. He's the Viceroy of Naples, a cousin of kings, a man whose ransom alone could finance the construction of a cathedral. In any previous century, his death would be a grand operatic event. He would be surrounded by enemies in heroic single combat, fighting magnificently to the last breath, perhaps yielding his sword to a worthy opponent with final noble words. But this is 1503. The old rules have changed forever. Through the choking haze of gunsmoke, an anonymous Spanish arquebusier, a man whose name history never bothered to record, spots the shimmering, expensive armor and the distinctive ostrich feathers of the enemy commander. He doesn't call out a formal challenge to single combat. He doesn't offer quarter or demand surrender. He simply levels his heavy weapon, takes a moment to steady his aim, and pulls the lever. A single lead ball the size of a large marble strikes Nemours directly in the chest. It punches through his expensive breastplate and kills him instantly. He falls from his horse into the dirt like a sack of grain, just another anonymous body in a growing pile of corpses. There is no final dramatic speech. There is no glorious last stand worthy of songs. The leader of the French army is simply deleted from the battlefield by a piece of cheap metal fired by a peasant. With Nemours dead, the organizational brain of the French army is gone. What remains is just a thrashing, dying body with no coordination. The Swiss pikemen fighting in French service tried desperately to push forward to support the dying cavalry, but they're immediately met by the German Landsknechts fighting for Spain. The two mercenary groups clash over the blood-soaked ditch in a grinding, shoving match of 18-foot pikes. But the momentum has shifted completely and irreversibly. Gonzalo, watching carefully from his command position on the ridge, sees the French beginning to waver and break. He sees the riderless horses galloping in panic. He sees the confusion rippling through their ranks like a wave. He knows from long experience that the psychological dam is about to burst completely. He gives the order he's been waiting to give: advance and finish them. This is the phase that truly earns the name the meat grinder. Is this what the future of warfare looks like? Mechanical slaughter instead of heroic combat. You're witnessing the birth of modern war, and it's uglier than anyone imagined. The Spanish infantry swarm out from behind their protective dirt wall like wolves scenting wounded prey. They're not just arquebusiers anymore. They're joined by rotileros, specialists armed with steel shields and short swords specifically designed for close combat. They dive into the tangled mess of the French cavalry with predatory efficiency. A knight on a horse in the open field is a terrifying opponent that most infantry wouldn't dare challenge. But a knight on a stationary horse trapped in a ditch, surrounded by men on foot who know his weaknesses, he's completely helpless. The Spanish soldiers slip under the bellies of the trapped horses with their short swords. They hamstring the beasts with quick, efficient cuts, bringing the knights crashing down. Once the knights are on the ground, their heavy armor becomes a coffin instead of protection. They cannot stand up quickly in the mud while wearing 60 pounds of metal. They're swarmed immediately by light infantry who use daggers to find and exploit the gaps in their armor, the visors, the armpits, the joints. It's brutal. Intimate violence. It's the revenge of the foot soldier who has been trampled by aristocratic cavalry for centuries. For generations, these common men had been considered expendable, looked down upon by the mounted nobility. Now they're pulling that nobility down into the mud with them and showing them what real fighting looks like. The French panic transforms into a complete rout. The Swiss mercenaries, realizing the battle is hopelessly lost and their paymaster is dead, begin to retreat in relatively good order. They're professionals who know when to cut their losses. The remaining French heavy cavalry, the ones who never reached the ditch, turn their horses and flee into the gathering twilight. The supposedly invincible French army hasn't just been defeated. It has been systematically dismantled and destroyed. The ditch at Cerignola is literally filled with the bodies of France's finest knights, piled high in a grotesque monument to their own arrogance and the obsolescence of their entire way of war. The sun has fully set now. The guns have finally fallen silent. The only sounds left are the crying of the wounded, begging for water, and the systematic looting of the dead by soldiers looking for valuables. The meat grinder has finished its work. The vineyard is a slaughterhouse. Could this really be the end of chivalry? Or is this just one bad day for the French when the sun rose over the region of Apulia the next morning? The scale of what had happened became horrifyingly clear. The French army, the finest military force in Christendom, had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force. The casualty numbers were so lopsided they looked like a mistake in the historical record. On the French side, nearly 4,000 men lay dead in the vineyard and the surrounding fields. Among them were Duke Nemours and practically the entire command structure of the French expeditionary force. The nobility of France had been decapitated in a single afternoon. On the Spanish side, estimates vary, but most contemporary sources put the number at around 100 men killed. Let that sink in for a moment. 4,000 French dead versus 100 Spanish dead. A kill ratio of 40-1. In the brutal mathematics of medieval warfare, this was theoretically impossible. Battles were usually grinding, shoving matches where both sides took similar casualties until one side's morale broke and they routed. But Cerignola wasn't a battle by any traditional definition. It was an industrial accident where only one side got hurt. This victory sent a shockwave through every royal court in Europe. Kings and generals looked at the detailed reports and realized with growing horror that the old world was dead. If a group of peasants with cheap guns and shovels could annihilate the French gendarmerie, then the entire social contract of feudalism was broken. The nobility's monopoly on military power had been shattered. For Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba, This wasn't just a victory, it was proof of concept for something much bigger. He took the lessons learned in that muddy trench, the combination of pikes to stop cavalry and guns to kill men from a distance, and he institutionalized them into a permanent system. He realized he couldn't always count on finding a convenient hill or ditch to hide behind. So he decided to bring the fortress with him. He reorganized the Spanish infantry into massive self-contained squares known as tercios. Imagine a moving fortress made entirely of people. In the center, you had the pikemen holding 18-foot spears, creating a bristling forest of steel that no cavalry could penetrate. On the corners and flanks, you had the arquebusiers, protected by the pikes, pouring fire into the enemy from relative safety. If cavalry charged, the gunmen simply retreated inside the protective square of pikes. If enemy infantry attacked, the pikes lowered to skewer them, while the arquebusiers shot them down. The tercio became the dominant military formation on Earth for the next 150 years. It was the machine that built the Spanish Empire from nothing. It conquered Italy. It held off the Ottoman Turks. It terrified the Dutch. It made the Spanish infantryman the most feared soldier in the world for generations. Cerignola was the laboratory where this monster was born and tested. It was the moment Spain graduated from being a fractured collection of medieval kingdoms to becoming the first modern superpower. And it all started because one man decided that digging a hole was a better strategy than dying with honor. What does that tell you about how the world really works? If you visit Cerignola today, you'll find a stone monument marking the site of the battle. It's quiet now, surrounded by the same vineyards and olive groves that witnessed the slaughter 5 centuries ago. But standing there, if you close your eyes, you can almost feel the ghostly weight of the transition that happened on this soil. The Battle of Cerignola was not the absolute end of cavalry warfare. Knights would continue to fight on horseback for another 400 years, all the way up to World War I. But the spirit of the mounted knight, the romantic idea that noble birth, personal courage, and a strong sword arm were the deciding factors in human conflict, died in that ditch on April 28th. Sen. It was the day that Romanticism ran headfirst into pragmatism and lost badly. Before this battle, war was often viewed through the lens of ancient epics, the Iliad, the Arthurian legends. It was personal. It was about individual valor, noble lineage, and the dramatic collision of great men in single combat. But Gonzalo Fernández de Córdoba stripped all the poetry away and revealed the ugly truth underneath. He showed the world that war is actually about geometry, chemistry, and logistics. He proved that a peasant with a machine is superior to a prince with a sword. He demonstrated that efficiency is the only currency that history actually respects. There is genuine tragedy in this transformation. Of course, we like the idea of the heroic knight. We want to believe in individual heroism and honor. There is something deeply noble about Duke Nemours refusing to retreat because his code of honor demanded he attack. His courage was real and admirable. But honor does not stop a lead bullet traveling at supersonic speeds. The lesson of Cerignola is brutal, and uncomfortable technology does not care about your tradition. It does not care about your noble rank, your years of training, your moral code, or your courage. Cold efficiency is the only thing that matters in the end. In many ways, We are living through our own Cerignola moment, right now, in the 21st century. Just as the Gunpowder Revolution disrupted the entire social order of the 16th century, we are watching automation, artificial intelligence, and drone warfare completely rewrite the rules of our world. We see traditional industries and old hierarchies crumbling before new, cheaper, and faster technologies that don't respect the old ways. We hear the complaints of the old guard that the new way is unfair, that it lacks human soul, that it's somehow cheating. The French knights probably thought the arquebus was cheating too. But the future didn't stop to listen to their complaints. The Spanish Empire that rose from the dust of Cerignola went on to dominate the entire globe for over a century, fueled by the terrifying efficiency of the tercios. They became the first truly global superpower, not because they were braver than everyone else, but because they were the first to fully accept the new reality. They understood that the world had changed forever, and they changed with it instead of clinging to the past. Are you adapting to the changes in your world? Or are you the knight charging at a ditch? So as we look back at the twilight of the armored knight dying in an Italian vineyard, we shouldn't just see a military defeat. We should see a warning and a lesson that applies directly to our own lives. The world is constantly digging new ditches and inventing new forms of gunpowder. Technology marches forward whether we approve or not. The question facing each of us is not whether we can stop the inevitable changes coming. The question is much simpler and more personal. Are we going to be the arrogant knight charging blindly into the past, refusing to adapt, insisting that the old ways must work because they always have? Or are we going to be the architect, standing calmly behind the dirt wall, ready to embrace whatever tools and methods actually work in the new reality? Regardless of how they make us feel, the choice seems obvious when you put it that way. But it's incredibly hard to make in practice because it requires admitting that everything you were taught might be wrong. Duke Nemours was raised from birth to believe that courage, noble blood, and the cavalry charge would always triumph. His entire identity was built on that foundation. When the battlefield changed, he couldn't change with it because it would mean admitting his entire life had been preparation for an obsolete world. So he charged anyway and died. Gonzalo had the humility to admit he'd been wrong at Seminara. He had the flexibility to completely reinvent himself and his army. He survived and thrived because he cared more about winning than about being right. That's the lesson: be humble enough to learn, flexible enough to change, and pragmatic enough to use whatever actually works. The Battle of Cerignola teaches us that nostalgia is a luxury that history cannot afford. We can appreciate the beauty and nobility of the medieval knight while also acknowledging that his time had passed. We can honor the courage of Nemours while learning from his fatal mistakes. Progress is not always pretty. The arquebus was ugly, unreliable, and seemed dishonorable compared to the sword. But it worked better, and that's all that mattered in the end. The future belongs to those who recognize what works and have the courage to adopt it, even when it feels wrong. So ask yourself honestly, in your own life, are you clinging to methods and beliefs that no longer work just because they're comfortable and familiar? Are you charging at ditches that smarter people have learned to avoid? Or are you constantly learning, adapting, and evolving with the times? The choice is yours. But history has already shown which choice leads to victory and which leads to dying in a ditch. What will you choose? Thank you for joining me on this journey into the forgotten trenches of history, where the medieval world died and the modern world was born. The Battle of Cerignola isn't just a dusty old story about knights and guns. It's a mirror held up to every moment of transition and disruption in human history, including the one we're living through right now. If you enjoyed this deep dive into how technology, strategy, and humility defeated tradition and arrogance, please make sure you're subscribed to Maproom Battles. Hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next documentary exploring the forgotten battles that changed everything. I genuinely want to hear from you in the comments section. Do you think the end of the chivalric era was a tragedy for human culture? Or was it a necessary and inevitable step toward the modern world? Does technology ultimately liberate us and make us more capable? Or does it just make killing more efficient and impersonal? Can we maintain human values and honor in a world increasingly dominated by cold technological efficiency? Or is that a romantic fantasy that Gonzalo would have dismissed as dangerous nonsense? These are not easy questions with simple answers, and I'm genuinely curious what you think. Let's have a real discussion down below in the comments. Share your perspective. Challenge mine if you disagree. That's how we all learn and grow together. And if you found value in this story, please hit that like button. It genuinely helps the channel survive the algorithm and reach more people who love learning about the hidden truths of history. Make sure you check out our other videos exploring similar moments where everything changed, where the old world collided with the new, and only one survived. Until next time, remember this fundamental truth. History is not just about what happened in the past. It's about who survived to tell the story. And more importantly, it's about the lessons we can learn to survive our own transitions. The ditch is being dug right now in your industry, your career, your life. The question is whether you'll see it before you charge into it. Stay curious, stay adaptable, and I'll see you in the next documentary where we explore another forgotten moment that changed the world forever.